So good morning. Good morning. Everybody have your seats. Thank you very much. Good morning and welcome to this session on recovery and reconstruction as part of the disaster management agenda. My name is Roger Morier. I'm going to be the moderator for the discussion this morning, and I think we have a pretty interesting series of sessions here for you to learn and to take away some important information. I have some minor housekeeping details. One is if you have a cell phone and if you have it on, now would be a good time to put it on vibrate or turn it off so we don't have an orchestra of cell phones ringing when this session is going on. And two, we want you to participate. There is a provision for audience participation. So in front of you, you should have some papers where you could write questions to ask the panelists or to ask people who are making presentations if you want to write your question down. If you want to be more modern, you can tweet your questions, so you can use your cell phones but keep them quiet, and you can tweet your questions to @GFDRR or use the hashtag recovery framework. And if you're really old-fashioned, then there's a way that you can send in your questions via email, and some of the questions may make it here, but some of the questions, they will all be answered. You send your questions to recoveryframework@gmail.com. And those questions will be answered on the website. So if you don't get the answers today, come back in a day or so and you will see the questions and the answers there as well. So let me begin. The focus today, as I said, is on recovery after a disaster. How recovery and reconstruction, if they're done the right way, can help to prevent serious damages in the future and damages to lives and to livelihoods, obviously, when disaster strikes. I think most people would agree that any recovery needs to be resilient. That's a key word. And the catchphrase, as you know, is building back better. Building infrastructure, building people's lives so that the next time something happens, the damages are less important. Now, after a disaster, governments are increasingly working with the international community on post-disaster needs assessment, the PDNA, and many countries have experience with this already, and some of those countries are going to be here to talk about that today. And that PDNA, that post-disaster needs assessment, can be seen as part of what is an evolving recovery framework, which the international community is moving towards, and we have experts here today to talk about that evolving recovery framework, how countries and international agencies can use the same language, use the same vocabulary, the same approach to building back better. So today, this session is in three parts. In the first part, we're going to have case studies from three countries. We're going to hear from Indonesia, from Japan, and from Pakistan. We're going to hear their experience in building back better and how they approached recovery and reconstruction after natural disasters in their country. So the first thing is to call on the representative from the government of Indonesia. That is Mr. Bambang Sulistianto, who is on my right. He is the Deputy Chief for Rehabilitation and Reconstruction for the National Disaster Mitigation Agency for the government of Indonesia. So Mr. Sulistianto, if you want to make your presentation, I welcome you. Now, I must say we have a certain amount of time for each presentation. We have representatives from Indonesia, Japan, and Pakistan. I have a watch, which is not from Indonesia, Japan, or Pakistan, but is from Switzerland. So I will use my Swiss watch to make sure that we stay on time, okay? Mr. Sulistianto.
Mrs. Moderator, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present a case study in post-disaster recovery from my country, Indonesia. As evident, Indonesia has had a series of disaster through which it has been able to learn and make improvement in recovery and risk reduction. Indonesia has institutionalized recovery mechanisms which are involved over time. The Agency for the Rehabilitation and Reconstruction for Aceh and Nias, BRR, was set up to manage for post-tsunami and earthquake recovery in April 2006. The National Disaster Management Agency has been set up with the mandates and institutional recovery capacity for recovery. This is a minister degree of late 2011, ensure that recovery and rehabilitation guidelines form the basis for all future post-disaster recovery effort. All this has led to the mainstream of a legal framework for recovery and risk reduction into national planning and budgeting, which has been key. This is the recovery scheme in our country. We start with an assessment, the post-disaster need assessment, PDNE, which integrate damage and loss assessment and human recovery need assessment. PDNE identifies early recovery and longer-term recovery needs towards sustainable development. It clarifies policy and regulatory framework and strategies, as well as resources allocated for the national government, local government, international partner, and the private sector. PDNE is the basis for formulation of the post-disaster rehabilitation and reconstruction action plan, which is usually implemented for 3 years. We involve the community through participatory planning, monitoring, and feedback mechanism. Community-based recovery had contributed to increase growth in the local economy. Mechanism such as the Multi-Donor Fund for Aceh and Nias and the Java Reconstruction Fund, we established to pool in donor resources for past recovery effort. This is our current financing mechanism for recovery. With support from international development partner, Indonesia has established the Indonesian Donor Fund, IDF, as a standing mechanism to help fund implement to the government rehabilitation and reconstruction action plan. The government also allocated significant resources for recovery from the national budget. A minimum of 10% has to be allocated for DRR from the recovery budget. Indonesia PDNE process takes a longer-term view by identifying recovery strategies that are more sensitive to future community needs, identifies underlying development rate cause of, and take a forward planning perspective. Following the PDNE, the government will produce an action plan for rehabilitation and reconstruction, RENACSI, a nationally owned framework which clarifies recovery priorities, provide a framework for allocation of resources by both national and local government. In summary, Indonesia has learned a lot from past disaster and has developed the necessary policies, institutional, and capacities to implement and monitor recovery. The country has also allocated sufficient budget for recovery, and PDNE tool and methods adapted to the country's special context. This helps guide for disaster recovery to be more people-centered and community-driven. They will contribute to sustainable development. Thank you for your attention.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Sulistiano. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Let me now call upon the representative of the government of Japan, Mr. Yoshitani Kamioka, who is the Parliamentary Secretary for Disaster Management, who has flown here all the way from Tokyo just to be part of this session and to speak to you today. So, Mr. Kamioka, the floor is yours, and we will have, I believe, simultaneous translation.
I'm sorry, I speak Japanese. 日本の内閣府政務官の亀岡義民です。
Kameoka, Yoshitani Kameoka from the Japanese government, parliamentary minister. I'm happy to have an opportunity to speak with you. I would like to report about the recovery and reconstruction of Japan after the Great Japan earthquake in March 2011. The recovery and reconstruction from the earthquake, the number of dead and unaccounted for is more than 18,000, and the number of completely damaged houses is 130,000. It's been 2 years since the occurrence of the earthquake. The affected area is steadily recovering and making a reconstruction effort. The number of evacuees has reached to 470,000 at peak. But this year in April, it's reduced to 300,000. And most people have been living in temporary houses or at government housing. In terms of infrastructure, the government infrastructure, except for the areas that are damaged completely with a tsunami or the emergency evacuation area after the nuclear disaster, the emergency reconstruction have been complete. And disaster debris from tsunami has reached 60 million tons. So at the time of January this year, 46% of the debris of 60 million tons have been processed. So our issue now is to build the town, including the evacuation plan to the higher grounds, and also the employment and the business. And in Japan, there's a new agency, Reconstruction Agency, has been established, and that's based on the law in June 2011. And that's been also upgraded to the ministry from the task force. And the reconstruction agency is based in Japan, and they also have 3 areas, 3 agency bureaus in the affected area, plus 8 bureaus in other parts. And their staff member is 420 people. And it will be the one-stop shop for municipalities for all the assistance and a coordination point. As for the budget for the reconstruction, it's a total of 25 trillion yen. And the source for that money would come from tax increase for reconstruction, which will be 10.5 trillion. And also securing from a reduction of austerity measures, and it will be 8.5 trillion. But we also have affected areas, and they have special measures for tax and finances. So we need to support the reconstruction of the areas. So we also have set up a new subsidy system. We also trying to reduce red tape for implementation so that the municipality would have less burden. In terms of Fukushima, this is where my hometown. I am from Fukushima. The evacuation area is periodically reviewed. Still, we have 150,000 people evacuated from the area. for the reconstruction and rebuilding of Fukushima, Japan has enacted a new law in 2012. It's called Fukushima Reconstruction Law. And especially we are concerned about the children who are in the affected area. For the victim children, we also have enacted a new law to support children. And also, there is a new Fukushima Recovery Agency established in 2013, and that agency will review the evacuation area and also decontamination. So we are concerned that there's a huge area of decontamination necessary because the contamination of environment has been done in wide areas. So we also enacted a new law in 2012 in January. So we have prioritized some areas to do decontamination first. So also the earth from this decontamination is safely transported, stored, and processed. So we have learned lessons from the Great East Japan earthquake. And we have actually, last summer, a final report on lessons and issues. First of all, we should not have anything unanticipated in disaster response. And secondly, assistance is required according to the changing needs and diversity of affected people. And number three, the effort should be taken with local communities, citizens, and businesses and governments. So with that lesson, we are revising the disaster countermeasure basic acts. We need to reinforce the response for disaster and also respond to affected people quickly. Also, we have to improve the system to actually help the local governments and also to help the necessity needs transported quickly. So we are actually preparing to have a new legal framework to help the reconstruction quicker and better. And that actually includes our in advance of recurrence to establish construction headquarters, development of basic reconstruction guidelines. And at the same time, we're building a strategy called National Resilience. This improves resistance and resilience with regard to large-scale disasters through comprehensive countermeasures with not only structural measures, but also non-structural measures. So we call it hard and soft policies. So the basic policy is to secure human lives by any means, and also significant functions should be maintained for government, economic, society. And also we need to mitigate the damage to property and facilities to prevent further damage. And also to enable quick recovery and construction. And that's the basic idea. So we would like to have the reconstruction with strength and flexibility. That is the summary of my report of the Japan's reconstruction recovery effort after the Great East Japan earthquake. Thank you very much. So we like to continue working hard. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kamioka. Thank you very much for that presentation. Let me now call upon Lieutenant General Nadim Ahmed, who is the former chairman of the National Disaster Management Authority and the former deputy chairman of the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority for the government of Pakistan. General Nadim.
Ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning. It's a proud privilege to present Pakistan's case study in a different backdrop where we had, and I'll try and compare the two disasters that we have handled. Ever since 2005, Pakistan has had to experience a series of disasters which included 3 earthquakes, we had 2 cyclones, we had 3 floods, we have 2 huge landslides, and we had a complex emergency going in our country. Every time we had a disaster, we had a PCNA done or a PDNA done. But the results of the recoveries are vastly different. And I'll try and find out as to why those results vary from very good to not so good. For the sake of brevity, I will take the two major disasters that we have handled. One is the earthquake of 2005, and the second is the floods of 2010. I know it's a busy slide, but I'll quickly go through the punchlines. In the earthquake of 2005, we had 3 million people which were affected, whereas in the floods, we had 20 million people who were affected, a population as big as that of Australia. In addition to 73,000 people being killed in the earthquake, we look at the area that was devastated. 30,000 square kilometers in the earthquake, vis-a-vis 100,000 square kilometers in the floods of 2010, and out of which 20% of the total arable land of Pakistan was underwater. The recovery costs were $5.5 billion vis-a-vis $10 billion in the floods. Now, in this, what we did in the earthquake of 2005, we created dedicated recovery structures with the name of Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority, whereas in the floods, we worked with the existing line departments, existing planning departments and line departments of the federal government and the provincial government. Now, with regard to the funding, there was dedicated funding for the earthquake of 2005, whereas in flood, there was the normal developmental funding that was used for the recovery effort. Third, the cash transfers in case of earthquake were conditional. If you make your house safe, you will get the money. Unlike in the floods where we just gave the money and did not put any conditionalities, thereby ending up with a lot of houses which were made at the same place in the floodplains. And that's the key point that I want to highlight. Now, after 2010 flood, when we had put in a lot of money in making those houses, we had floods in 2011 as well as in 2012. And what happened? These floods washed away all the investment that was done in the previous year. So the first key point that I want the audience to take away is that the recovery also has to be resilient. We keep on talking of mainstreaming disaster risk reduction into development, but I think recovery has to be extremely resilient to be able to withstand the next disasters. Otherwise, you will keep falling back on your developmental objectives as well as the Millennium Development Goals, thereby proving the adage which says that the resilient recovery is a developmental imperative. Third thing, we had a very successful donor conference because it was held just in case of earthquake, just after 5 weeks of the earthquake. We did not have the same thing in the floods of 2010 where it was done after 5 months. Thereby, we lost the sympathy factor and the optics factor. And the donors have their own ways or variations of funding. In earthquake, we made arrangements to accommodate the donor variations. Some wanted to come and give the budgetary support, some wanted to help the NGOs, some wanted to do things bilaterally, whereas in case of floods, we said no, nothing else. Every money that the donor provides will be given as a budgetary support to the government, thereby losing out on a lot of goodwill that could be generated in shape of funding. And then, of course, we had a one-window facilitation operations after the earthquake, which we did not have after the floods of 2010. When you look at the two results, I think the achievements after the earthquake were outstanding, a role model by any standards, whereas we don't see the same in the floods of 2010. So my key point was that in both the cases, the PDNAs were done. But in one case, there was an effective recovery framework put in place, whereas in the other case, it was not done so. So the lesson that I want you to carry is that the PDNA and an efficient recovery framework go hand in hand together. You can't look at it in isolation. One gives you the recipe, other gives you the prescription. Now, some of the key recovery priorities that we had set after the earthquake was, of course, the stabilization of the services. Then we injected money through different procedures, livelihood cash grants, housing grants, compensation for deaths. And we realized that when you put money into the system, it generates an activity of its own, which helps towards normalization. So I think that's another key point that I would like to highlight. And of course, don't forget to harness the market forces. And when there is so much of destruction, there are opportunities. You have to rebuild really massive. So train the people. There will be, if you have abilities or capacities to develop skills of the people, those very people can be very optimally utilized during the reconstruction process, converting an adversity into an opportunity. And of course, don't forget the secondary disasters, and health is very critical. So we focused on health as well as road infrastructure, which was critically important to let the process of reconstruction go, because this was a mountainous area. If we didn't have the roads to carry the construction materials up, we couldn't carry out the reconstruction. Now, a word about recovery financing, and I think that's very critical. And early PDNA actually formed the basis for identifying the overall losses and the requirements that we had in every sector. And as I said, in one case, this was done within 5 weeks. And in another case, it had to wait for 5 months. And my takeaway point for you is, don't wait, because you want to perfect a document. Go for it. When there is sympathy factor, when the iron is hot, that's the time you will get the assistance. Otherwise, if you delay it unnecessarily, you're not going to get the donations that should be normally coming. We held a very successful donors conference, and you will be very glad to know, because we had made processes and procedures with an implementation mechanism, with an implementing agency, fiduciary safeguards, what will be the monitoring and evaluation arrangements. We got commitments in excess of our requirement. We needed $5 billion, and the commitments were made to $6 billion. And I'm very proud to say that we got all those pledges and commitments converted into final release of funds to the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehab Authority. Then, of course, we had dedicated donors and sponsor cells to accommodate the small assistances coming from philanthropists, from NGOs, from INGOs, from the corporate sector. And since we had made the arrangements, all that money ultimately became a big pot and was really extremely helpful in kickstarting the recovery process. So again, I think the key point that you need to look at is that you need to create arrangements where anyone who wants to help in any manner should be accommodated. Some of the guiding principles that we had, of course, full ownership of all stakeholders, including the line departments, the civil society, the affected communities, to ensure smooth transition. Because once you are doing reconstruction through dedicated institutions, ultimately it has to be handed over to the line departments. And there will be institutional resistance if you don't start to incorporate their viewpoints right at the start of the recovery. Mainstream DRR, and this is critical. We also need to take mainstream the environmental safeguards as well as the gender dimension. But you must remember that sustainable recovery leads to sustainable development, because sustainable recovery actually showcases that it can be done. And therefore, please make sure that you don't kind of give less attention to ensuring a resilient recovery. The point that I wish to highlight, the point that I wish to highlight is that during this process, all your policies have to be pro-poor, because it affects the poor segment of the population really hard, and they have very little coping mechanisms to fight back to such kind of disasters. Because of mainstreaming DRR, we had another great advantage which we observed in floods of 2010. Because the entire recovery was resilient, therefore the impact of floods in the same area was far less than some of the areas where we were going with the work as usual approach. Let me go to the next slide, and this is about the institutional arrangements. We had, as I said, a new dedicated body called the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehab Authority, And unfortunately, in 2010 floods, it was not the case. Another striking feature of our recovery was that ERA actually capitalized on the government servants, on the army, as well as the consultants from the market. Now, the government servants brought in the knowledge of government rules, regulations, and procedures. The army brought in the speed and the mass. They could inspect 600,000 houses that we had lost. And the consultants from the market gave us the intellectual input so that the process, when you look at the three kind of inputs and see a synergy is created, the impact is much more stronger than the sum of the individual three. The implementation was devolved to the provinces, and that is very critical because you need to have ownership of the provincial departments. And likewise, unless you develop customized processes of procurement, of contracting, of financial management, of a grievance redressal system, it will not work with your usual thing. So the key point that I want you to take away from this is that work as usual approach in a recovery operation is not going to work. You will have to come up with something extra, with a quality HR, with customized processes, with a team which is committed and can deliver, because you are doing something which is really time sensitive. Some of the issues that how we manage the programs, and I think the most critical point is second last from bottom, which is that all policy that you evolve has to be based on consensus. Consensus building is difficult, but once the policies arrived through consensus are put to the practice, everybody owns it and makes sure that it is done. Lastly, some of the lessons and good practices, of course, you need to have a dedicated organization. You need to have a very robust coordination and facilitation with all kinds of stakeholders, including the donors, the UN, the INGOs, and the government. A focus on community engagement and devolution and implementation. A very well articulated and a robust communication strategy. Then you need to see the relief, the early recovery, and the reconstruction as one continuum. If you divorce one from the other, you are going to create problems for yourself. There are a lot of international best practices lying outside your own country, and we are extremely grateful to the World Bank, to the Asian Development Bank. They brought those practices to the table for us to look at it and adapt if we were comfortable. And we adapted a lot of good practices from the rest of the world. I also feel that with imagination, adversity can be built into an opportunity, and we must prioritize and sequence the recovery operation in accordance with the need of people. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, General Nadeem. You can see how passionate General Nadeem is because of the experience that Pakistan has gone through. I wanted to also signal that on the far left of the panel, we've been joined by Dr. Suprayogo Hadi, who is the Deputy Minister for the Development of Special Regions in the Government of Indonesia and part of the Ministry for the Development of Disadvantaged Regions. And he is here to explain a bit more, a little bit how Indonesia has tackled reconstruction and recovery. I just wanted to ask you one question, Dr. Hadi. You've heard General Nadeem talk about a number of factors about involving the local population, about a recovery framework, about consensus on policy. I wonder, for you in Indonesia, what do you think has been the most important element in building back better? You've had a number of experiences at the national level. So what do you think is the number one thing that the audience needs to keep in mind? It should be on.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I think this is going to be very good, the power of planning and budgeting in this case. We are talking about the planning because the assessment already been done, the PDNA, the RCRNA, and also some assessment that already been done before. And then we formulating the master plan, for instance, like Aceh, and also the action plan for other disaster region. And also we are developing also the funding mechanism actually for that kind of situation. And as I said also in the previous featured event that Indonesia already been committed that 10% of the recovery process budget at least already been allocated for the DRR initiatives. So the DRR investment is come up with priority along with the process of the recovery process. And we also try to also adopt, like General Nadim mentioned, how the participatory process of the community-driven reconstruction process is also very powerful actually in making the process of recovery faster and also effective in this case.
So you found a way then to, in effect, mainstream the disaster recovery and the reconstruction in national policy.
Yes, it's already been very clear in our national policy, in our medium-term development plan, in our NEP-DRR, and also in every single national action plan for recovery. We put the DRR investment clearly there, that at least 10% has to be allocated for the DRR. That's why, for instance, like in the 2010 earthquake in Yogyakarta, we had that none of the building or the housing already been built since 2006 after the earthquake, the big earthquake collapse. So it means that we've already been investing the DRR in the reconstruction of the housing at the time.
Right, so there's proof that it works.
Yes.
You can say that it works.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And let me remind you that if you have questions for any of the people on the stage, that you have these papers, and if you have a written question, if you haven't tweeted the question or if you haven't emailed it, write it on the piece of paper and wave it. We have people on either side who will pick up the papers from you, either now or for the panelists that are coming later. Now, General Nadim, we have a bit of time, so let me just ask you. You heard Dr. Hadi as well, but when you talk about Pakistan, do you see this obviously as a development imperative as well, the Building Back Better, to mainstream that in development policy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there should be absolutely no doubt about it that you have to mainstream DRR, not only in the recovery process, but also do it in the normal development process. And we in Pakistan, with the help of National Disaster Management Authority, has been able to work out with the Planning Commission, as well 10 leading ministries which are involved in infrastructure development, that they have a complete kind of a questionnaire which they have to satisfy, like we used to have, the environmental impact assessment. Now you have the damage impact assessment as well. And I'm quite hopeful that once this culture sets in, it's just starting, it's not really mature, but just once the culture sets in, then probably our development should be as resilient. Additionally, then what Dr. Suprayogi said, even in our country, there is a percentage from every development budget which is earmarked for the DRR activities.
Very good. There was one question from the audience. I wanted to ask it of Mr. Kamioka. You have the translation. Okay. The question is, how does Japan make sure that new houses are seismically safe, that are prepared for the possibility of an earthquake? And how do you think developing countries who are looking to you, how can they make sure that what they build is seismically safe? They have many other priorities, obviously. So how do they make sure that their new construction is safe against earthquakes? Do we have the microphone on? Sorry. Can we turn on Mr. Kamioka's microphone?
Yeah.
Yes, now.
どんな地震が来てもですね、耐えられる建物を作るということで、免震構造という新しいですね、揺れを吸収する建物というものを今、作り上げています。ですからまさに日本の最高技術でどんな地震が来ても倒れないような免震構造の建物を今全部義務付けています。ですからきちんとですね、建築基準法という法律の中でしっかりと新しい建物に対してはどんな地震が来ても倒れないような構造、免震構造を義務付けているということと、ぜひこれからですね、各これから耐震免震構造をやられる方々には日本の技術を大いに使っていただいて、我々要請があればいつでもその技術を皆さんに一緒になって提供しますので、ただできれば津波が来そうなところにはですね、10メーター間隔で一つ堅固な建物を作っていただいて、 もう5分から10分以内でその建物に避難できるというような津波が来そうなところには最低限そういう避難所の高層の堅固な建物を作るということはぜひ義務付けていただきたいと思います。
Okay. Very good. Thank you, sir. Thank you. We're going to, I wanted to thank our panelists this part of the session now, that Mr. Sulistianto and General Nadim and Mr. Kamioka and Mr. Supraga. Thank you very much for taking part. Let's have some applause for their contributions. Now we're going to have a bit of a change here. So gentlemen, you will come down. Now I'd like to invite up to the stage, we have two people who are going to talk about the post-disaster needs assessment and about the recovery framework. And as General Nadim said, one is a prescription and one is also necessary. You need both of those at the same time in recovery. So we have Claes Anderson, who is the International Relations Officer for the Stability Instrument Operations Service for Foreign Policy Instruments of the European Commission. And we also have Mr. Raja Arshad, who is the lead disaster risk management specialist for GFDRR, which we all know is the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, and working at the World Bank. So Claes Anderson, do you want to make your presentation first? Again, this is about the post-disaster needs assessment, the PDNA, and come up here. And then the, how that works with the evolving recovery framework. The international community is working to bring these both together for better reconstruction and recovery. So Claes, the floor is yours.
This now is actually, it's a joint presentation, as was said here, between the three organizations, UN, World Bank, and the EU, on the work that we do together with a lot of other partners as well on post-disaster assessments and their follow-up, recovery frameworks and so on. We have a formal cooperation between the three of us since late 2008. An agreement was signed that we do this work together, all the three organizations together. And the ultimate objective of that is, of course, to strengthen national capacity for disaster response and disaster prevention. Just a short recap on, I know most of you are very familiar with it, but a short recap of what a PDNA is. Starting with the assessment, bringing together assessment of the economic value of damages and the losses over time to the economy, with an impact on human development as experienced by communities, by the population. These assessments should, of course, also be done, and they should lead to a recovery plan, integrating both sides here, human, socioeconomic impacts, but also looking at productive side, infrastructure damages, and so on. This plan, should serve as a bridge, covering the period between immediate, let's say, humanitarian response and the longer-term risk reduction and development activities. So what have we done now since 2008, or rather early 2009? I mean, we've undertaken some 50 assessments together, the three of us, but of course also working with a number of other partners, governments and other partners on that. And the experience we have gained on this is developed into